Wow, Lucas, you spent a whole month writing a video script and it's just gonna be about Dasli? Yup, and dang it, you will love it. Look, I know, I'm not proud of this video length. Uberfest and Epicfest, these banner houses some of the most powerful units in the Battle Cats throughout the history of the game. Arguably, the two of the best that ever came out of these banners are Mitama the Oracle and Kasli the Bane. And yet, one has been positively received by the community when she came out, while the other is subject to a lot of debate and sometimes are certain people's most hated unit. I'm certain people. But why is that? Why is it that Mitama the Oracle is very much loved by the community and yet Kasli the Bane seems to have such a mixed reception? Today we are here to... okay, like the script says I'm supposed to have like a game theory-ish intro, but honestly I've no idea what to put here, so let's just get right into it, man. Before we talk about the main unit in question, there are a couple of things that I want to touch first. For one, I think most people coming in here already knows why she's hated. The very simple answer is because she's insanely strong. That's it. End video, you can leave now. But to truly understand how strong she really is in perspective, first we need to talk about parallel universe. Well, no, but we do need to go back in time, 8 years in the past from now. I guess if the whole time traveling thing, creating a new parallel dimension theory thing is true, then I guess we are talking about parallel universe. But anyways, April of 2016, update 5.0 of the Battle Cats dropped with a new Uber by the name of Mighty Lord Gao, the MLG beast himself, as some people would call him. He's an Uber that is only exclusively available in the also new uberfest banner. Uberfest being the gacha banner where every non-limited Ubers in the game are in the gacha pool, meaning you can get every Ubers that are not collapse, seasonals, and girls mons, which is in a perpetual limbo. You can only get Gao from this banner, and since this banner is mixed with hundreds of other Ubers, you only have a very slim chance of getting Gao. So, let's talk about Mighty Lord Gao. Gao is a very unique powerhouse at the time. He is somewhat of a generic range attacker in terms of a role. Big range attacker, no debuffs, no waves, no pierce, none of that. He does have some uniqueness though, one being that he has two different usable forms, similar to that of the Ultra Souls banner, where the first form is a cheaper, more spammable form, while the second form is the more heavy-duty one. For the sake of simplicity, I will only talk about specifically the evolved form of all Uberfest units in this video. The second thing is that he is immune to wave attacks. Now, this might be common now, but back then this wasn't common at all. It is absurdly rare to ever have any good anti-wave units. As for what waves are, we'll touch on that later if you don't know about it. Now, stat-wise, his health, range, and damage are all pretty well rounded. You know, it's nothing too special, but what makes him really stand out is that he has the ability of Strong Against for all non-traitless enemies. Strong Against the ability means that he deals 50% extra damage and receives only 50% of incoming damage from traded enemies. It's a bit more than that with treasures, but that's the gist of it. That makes him pretty powerful against basically any situations, as this means that his stats are very much above average towards any non-traitless enemies. At that time when Gao was first a thing, a unit that counters more than 2 traits was a very rare occurrence. The only Ubers aside from Gao that counters many traits at once are generally units from the Luga banners. And the Lugas were not really well known to be the best of things around. They kinda still aren't. Ironically, people's favorite Lugas in the banner doesn't even target any traits. Gao doesn't counter technically everything though. Remember that he counters non-traitless enemies. So these enemies without traits does not receive the extra damage from his ability. Or rather, enemies with the traitless trait. Yeah, traitless is a name of a trait. It's a bit dumb, but it is what it is. He's not quite useless against traitless enemies though. Like I mentioned, his base stats is actually still pretty decent. So even against traitless enemies where his strong versus does not activate, he actually still performs decently well. Gao's main downside is mainly his extremely high cost, being 6,000 in evolved form, while most Ubers generally range around 4,000 to 5,000. Plus his usage is pretty generic in a way. It's not something super special. He doesn't have anything special outside of just having good stats. A decent amount of specialist Ubers will still outclass Gao in their specific niche. For example, let's take a look at Tundia, a unit with pretty average damage but deals 3 to 4 times more damage against red enemies. If faced against a red focus stage and you have to choose between Gao or Tundia, then chances are Tanya would outperform Gao against red enemies by a huge margin. I say chances are because Gao's damage resistance can also come in handy at certain situations. Still, Gao's insane versatility was just too good, being a true jack of all trades. Not to mention his wave immunity also came in really handy for certain enemies. Remember that back then there wasn't actually that much anti-wave units. All of this combined makes him still respected as one of the best units you can possibly have. A generic range attacker being a top tier uber. What simple times this was. Fast forward to 8 months later in January 2017 on update 5.8. Gao is now no longer the only exclusive unit in Uberfest. Now, a second exclusive Uber joins the rank, a Shrine Maiden of pure white, Mitama the Oracle. First thing that some people might notice is that Mitama retains some of the uniqueness that Gao has, mainly 1. Having 2 different usable forms, 2. Having immunity to waves, and 3. Having abilities that counters every traits except for traitless. These 3 traits ends up being something that every Uberfest units in the future has, although currently point number 1 does not apply to 2 Uberfest units. Now, as for Mitama, she is not quite that similar to that of Gao. Instead of being a damager, she is instead a support debuffer. Her main deal is that she can cast Slow against non-traitless enemies. Slow being the ability that sets the enemy's speed to 1, essentially making them not really able to advance forward. And her slow debuff lasts for a pretty long time too, of nearly 4 seconds, while her attack rate is around 5 seconds. This means that she can nearly permanently slow any traded enemies, and enemies that are hit by her attacks can only move for about 1 second for every 5 seconds. Plus, since her target enemies are traded enemies, this means that her slow are buffed because of the story mode treasures. The future on Cosmos treasures has these fruits that increase the ability effect for traded enemies, making her slow a bit more potent against them. Plus, you can also use cat combos by adding certain unit combinations in your lineup that can increase the duration of the slow. It does waste a couple of slots in your lineup, but it can make her induce nearly true perma-slow. Not to mention, Mitama has the long distance or LD ability, which allows her attack to extend through her target, and hits enemies even behind her main target range that is farther than her, extending her reach, making her slow so much more potent. The long distance ability would also cause the user to have a blind spot though, making her unable to hit enemies that are too close to her. However, on top of the slow debuff, she also has the ability of resisting attacks from traded enemies, which means that she receives only about 25 to 20% of enemies' attacks. So she has around 4 or 5 times the effective health against traded enemies. In addition to that, her knockback count is 15, which is a lot. This means that every 1 per 15 of her health that is depleted, she will stagger backwards, which allows her to reposition herself out of danger. Not only that this gives her extra survivability, but this allows her to reposition herself so that she can now hit enemies that were once in her blind spot. And she even has immunity to pretty much every debuff at the time of her release. Her cooldown is 145 seconds, which isn't too short or too long, but since her survivability is great, she can outlive her cooldown and potentially allow you to have 2 Mitamas in the field, which, if they're desync, can easily permanently slow enemies down. This quality allows Mitama to be probably one of, if not the best unit in the game at the time, being able to nearly permanently immobilize majority of enemies. Still, despite that, it's not like she didn't come with any downsides. For one, even though she has 4 to 5 times the effective health against traded enemies, her base health is actually incredibly low, being only at 29,000 health at level 30. That's only slightly higher than an Eraser cat. That is not much. Sure, her effective health against traded enemies is 116 to 145k, but if you're using her against a stage that has a hard-hitting traitless enemies, and if the traitless enemies hits Mitama, she will lose a huge chunk of her health. Sometimes she would even just immediately die. Not to mention her standing range is actually pretty low. 350 range is only around the same as Paris Cat or Gross Cat, which is considered to be just a mid-ranger unit. Plus, her damage is far from great. In fact, it's relatively low. It's good enough to chip off some hard-to-reach enemies, or even stagger or kill some peons, but it's still really not much. It's like getting a slap from her, which some people are probably into. Hey, I won't judge. You're still gonna have to finish off the enemies with other units. This also basically means that she is essentially near worthless against traitless enemies. Low health, low damage, and low range, she just wouldn't really function for anything at all. Maybe at most for the wave immunity, but frankly chances are you usually have better options. Also, her high knockback count can even be used against her. The long distance ability that I mentioned before can also exist on enemies, and this can be really bad news for Mitama. If faced against stages that has LD enemies, these enemies can potentially juggle her. They can hit her from afar and disallowing her from advancing to inflict her debuff because she would just get staggered over and over again. Usually against these enemies, you either want to rush or tank their hits to be able to reach their blind spot. But Mitama doesn't have high speed to rush in, and due to her 50 knockback count, she can't really tank either. Every time she gets hit, she would stagger backwards. She can survive a long time, yeah, but she can't tank. You could do certain setups to allow Mitama to enter the enemy's blind spot, like using slow meat shields or decreasing the amount of meat shields, or using the cannon to allow her to be able to enter the blind spot, but these stuff are generally still unfavorable. She can still struggle a lot in some stages, and yet despite all of these shortcomings, she is still considered to be, like I said, one of if not the best unit in the game. Her near permanent slow debuff is just so incredibly powerful that even though she has her flaws, she still is a top pick. People in the community like her a lot. She is incredibly powerful in the right place and the right time, which fortunately for her is a lot of place and time because she counters like majority of enemies in the game, but you don't quite just win every stage for free either. You'll need to be careful of using her in some stages with traitless enemies, LD enemies, or enemies with high range in general. Plus she can't exactly kill everyone on her own. She just does the debuffing. You're gonna have to bring out other units to synergize with her. There are ways to circumvent the problems that she has if you strategize enough, and I think that's why people love this unit. She isn't just absurdly powerful, she's also pretty intricate and fun. Ponos actually has successfully made a top tier Uber that people actually like. Now, there's also one more Fest banner aside from Uberfest, and this one is Epicfest. The name's Epicfest. Wait, I already mentioned Epicfest earlier in the video. Why did I write this joke? Similar to Uberfest, Epicfest also has every non-limited Ubers in the game and has their own special exclusive Ubers. You can't get Epicfest exclusive in Uberfest and vice versa. The Epicfest units are the dark version of Uberfest units, where there's Gao, there's Shadow Gao, where there's Mitama, there's Gothic Mitama. This is a more dark, messed up version of the Uberfest unit, just a glimpse into my dark reality. Let's first talk about Gothic Mitama, or Dark Mitama. Gothic Mitama is a unit that functions very similarly with Mitama the Oracle. She has lots of knockback count, she has mediocre health, she has mediocre damage, and she has similar standing range, as well as the ability to slow. Seems to be basically the same thing as Mitama the Oracle. However, Gothic Mitama has a couple of key differences, mainly that her only trait targeting is traitless, the only trait that normal Mitama does not target. That's right, this is Epicfest specialty, targeting traitless enemies instead of traited one. Traitless at the time has very little units that counters them and often is considered to be made to not have counters. And there are many traitless enemies that are giving player lots of trouble, whether it be Arost, crazed enemies, or manic enemies, tower bosses like Hermit and Yulala, and so on. So having units that specifically counter traitless, that is very new. I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate, as you all also hate Arost too, don't you? Of course, even though traitless are pretty well known to be troublesome, this is still just one trait out of many. So to compensate for the lack of targets, Epicfest units generally has better stats all around compared to the Uberfest counterpart. Generally better health, better damage, better range, and even having a bonus ability. All of these above applies to Gothic Mitama, and Gothic Mitama's bonus ability is being able to weaken traitless enemies' damage by half. This is quite a lot of strength for a unit, but this is somewhat fair as she's only focused on one trait. This was also the case for Shadow Gao, the dark counterpart of Gao. Instead of Gao's strong versus ability, Shadow Gao possesses the massive damage ability against traitless enemies. Massive damage means that their damage multiplier is 3 instead of the 1.5 that strong versus has, although they do not have the increased resistance of damage. As an added bonus, he also has the guaranteed chance to freeze traitless enemies for a short period every attack. Shadow Gao too has better base stats compared to his uberfest counterpart Gao. Since his base stats is higher than Gao, his performance is pretty respectable for non-traitless enemies even without needing to rely on his ability, and thus at the time he was also considered to be one of the best units in the game. And of course, he is an ungodly powerful unit against traitless enemies. Like I said, traitless enemies at the time has very little counters, both in non-Ubers and Ubers department, so Shadow Gao was considered to be an extremely popular unit, especially when this stage Floor 30 came out, being a stage that focuses on a traitless boss that does wave attacks. Having really high damage against traitless enemies and even has wave immunity, he is the top pick for Floor 30. Shadow Gao became an extremely wanted unit amongst the players and even kind of became a meme for how much people wanted him. Mitama, however, didn't quite have the same reception. Not a lot of people consider her to be top tier or even that high tier at all. She's incredibly powerful against traitless enemies, sure, but there's basically no reason for you to ever use her against traded enemies. Yes, she has better base stats than Mitama, but Mitama never really had good base stats to begin with. Remember, her damage is low, her base health is low, and her range is mediocre, so even though Mitama has those bonuses, it still doesn't really make her stats that good. To make things worse, since there are no future and Cosmos treasure for traitless enemies, her slow is actually shorter than that of Mitama's. It's still nearly perma-slow, but it does allow some enemies to have more chance to escape. Even against specifically traitless threats, Shadow Gao was considered to be the better choice compared to Mitama. Shadow Gao's incredibly powerful damage output simply was just able to brute force most traitless enemies without the need to debuff them whatsoever. Don't get me wrong, Mitama is still incredibly powerful against traitless enemies, being able to still nearly perma-slow them and even weakening them. But who needs debuff when you can just straight out kill the enemies? The enemies can't push if they're dead. What are they gonna do, roll in their graves? Simple problem solving. Still, this is only kind of the problem if you're comparing the two. Like I said, Mitama in her own right is still an amazing unit against traitless. Her debuffs are amazing as a support and she can still absolutely destroy most traitless focus stage. And her stat buff actually does somewhat help in mixed trait stage, as her damage is actually high enough to now contribute on killing peons or backliner enemies regardless of their traits. And like I mentioned before, anti-traitless at the time is very rare to come by, so people still value her pretty greatly despite her specific niche. And also people think that she has gigantic dumpy and think she's hot, so she's still popular amongst Battlecats artists. Anyways, unlike the Epicfest where Shadow Gao reigns supreme, in uberfest Mitama the Oracle is still the preferred choice of the two. Even though Gao has powerful stats, he does not quite dominate his trait targets like Shadow Gao did. He's still really strong, but not to the point where you can just brute force everything. And so Mitama's powerful support capabilities still reign supreme. Now, so far we've talked about the first two fest units, Gao and Mitama. Kasli and Dark Kasli, which is the main focus of the video, are the fourth of the fest. So one more thing before we talk about them. I know some of you might be getting sleepy at this point, but look, hey, look, wake up, stop sleeping. Come on, we got one more set of units to go through, stay awake. I'll slap you if you want to just like sleep in my class. Don't you sleep in my class. Okay, you good? Wash your face. Now, let's talk about D'Artagnan, the Meowsketeer. Yes, D'Artagnan. He is based off the character D'Artagnan. I have no idea how to spell this name. D'Artagnan from the story The Three Musketeers, which is kind of funny because even though his evolved name is Meowsketeer, in the story D'Artagnan isn't even part of the Three Musketeers. I always thought it was kind of funny. Anyways, released in November of 2017, he is the third to join the ranks of the uberfest exclusive. Similar to his predecessor, he is a unit that targets non-traitless enemies. His niche is that of an LD piercing rusher, the long distance thing. A high speed, low mid-range-ish unit with LD and the ability to do massive damage against traded enemies. Massive damage, as mentioned before, is the ability to multiply your attack by 3 or up to 4 depending on your treasures. Now, on release, people actually doubted D'Artagnan for a while. There was even talks that maybe he's just like B tier unit, like just mid. After all, his health and range is pretty low, so theoretically he would die pretty quickly, especially with his high speed. He would be pretty suicidal. But after players try him for a while, people realize that his rusher capability is actually quite sublime. His high speed and piercing LD with explosive damage results in the destruction of hard to reach enemies really quickly. Even if he couldn't survive long due to his tendency tendency to just run into his own death. If he survives even for just a decent amount of time, he would wreak havoc upon his enemies. Of course, like the other fest units, he is not great against traitless ones. His base damage is actually pretty low without the ability, so he basically only still does like ticklish damage to traitless. And so this is where his dark counterpart, D'Artagnan, appears. That's like D'Artagnan, but dark? Like D'Artagnan? Okay, from now on, I'm gonna call the original Uberfest D'Artagnan as Meowsketeer to avoid confusion. Now, let's talk about Valiant D'Artagnan. But, well, I mean, I think knowing how G.Mitama and S.Gao works, you should get the gist of the kind of unit that he is. D'Artagnan is very similar to Meowsketeer, but with slightly better base stats and only targeting traitless. His standing range, damage, and health are all better than that of Meowsketeer's. Hell, D'Artagnan's health is actually double of that of Meowsketeer's. And his damage compared to Meowsketeer is actually pretty decently high. All of this combined helps D'Artagnan to be actually a pretty good unit even for traded enemies that he doesn't target. Obviously, he destroys traitless enemies that he has incredibly big damage against them. But even for traded ones, his great bulk of health and higher range means that even though he can't dish out the same damage as Meowsketeer, he can stay in the field longer. But that's not all. Remember how Epicfest unit also gains one more bonus ability? Well, in the case of D'Artagnan, once his health goes down under 60%, his damage will double. This double damage actually makes his damage output to rival that of Meowsketeer's against traded enemies. Meowsketeer's peak DPS against traded enemies at level 30 is around 13,000. Meanwhile, D'Artagnan's peak DPS against traded enemies at level 30 is around 10,000. Yes, D'Artagnan's damage is still noticeably lower, and not to mention he only gains the double damage when he's down to half health, but when you also consider his higher range and how he absolutely blasts the rarely counted traitless enemies away, D'Artagnan is still sometimes the preferred choice between the two. But some people might still prefer Meowsketeer. Remember, D'Artagnan's strengthen only activates when his health is nearly halved, which at that point his health would be similar to that of Meowsketeer, and he'd only have half of this knockback count left. So it's not like he's all better than Meowsketeer. D'Artagnan is still essentially a safer Meowsketeer though. It's like as if D'Artagnan is like Meowsketeer with his weaknesses patched up. Meowsketeer is supposed to be this glass cannon with lower range and lower health and not that great of a survivability. Meanwhile, D'Artagnan is that, but you know, with better health, better range, and unlike Meowsketeer, he is still relevant against traitless enemies. Basically, D'Artagnan removes some of Meowsketeer's problem, while at the same time not exactly completely outshining Meowsketeer. Meowsketeer is still the glass cannon high risk high reward, while D'Artagnan being the easier one to use, with still greater damage output. And obviously, you know, really good against traitless enemies. Okay, but Lucas, come on now, are all of these really necessary? I'm here to hear you talk about Kasli the Scourge and Kasli the Bane. Why you keep talking about these irrelevant Ubers? Well, John, I can assure you all of these will be relevant soon. Everything that I have said will be on the test, and at the end of the test, there will be a cake. However, if I see you asking dumb questions in the comments, I'll subject you to 1,000 years of treasure grinding. You listening now? Good. January of 2020, Kasli the Scourge was revealed, being the 4th Uberfest exclusive unit. As an Uberfest, she has all of the Uberfest traits, you know, 2 different forms, wave immunity, and an ability to target all traded enemies. Her ability is that she has a 50% chance to knock traded enemies back. But on top of that, Kasli the Scourge also has a new ability called the Surge attack. Previously, I've mentioned an ability called Wave. This is an ability where if a unit hits the enemy, the unit will have a chance to produce a shockwave that extends from them. This wave's damage is as strong as the main attack's damage, therefore this could potentially double the damage output of a unit, while also extending the reach of their attacks. This is extremely powerful, and this is what the Uberfest units are immune to. I probably should have explained this sooner, but I did say we're gonna bring this up. Anyways, Surge, similar to Wave, also allows the user to generate an extra shockwave when the unit hits their enemies. Wave and Surge also carries the ability of the main attacker's ability. So if Kasli's initial attack induces knockback, then the Surge too will induce knockback on traded enemies. However, instead of extending from the source like Wave, Surge's shockwave spawns on a semi-random predetermined position and lingers for a while. The previous shockwave has a level, and the shockwave's level would determine how far the wave would travel. This Surge also has level, and this level would determine how long the surge would linger on the field, as well as how many times it can deal damage to the same enemy. Waves can only hit the same enemies once, while surge can hit the same enemy multiple times, the same amount as the surge's level. So a level 1 surge can hit an enemy once, level 2 surge can last longer and hit an enemy twice, and so on and so on. Now, Kasli the Scourge's surge is level 2. This means that her surge can hit an enemy up to 2 times. This also means that she can damage an enemy 3 times, once from her attack and 2 more from the surge. So if all of these attack lands, her damage output would triple. Her base DPS at level 30 is about 3000, and so if all of these 3 attacks lands, this would effectively become 9000 DPS. That is pretty big. It's not quite over 9,000, but it's basically 9,000. It's basically 9,000! Kasli also has LD, the piercing attack that I mentioned before. Generally, units with LD have lower damage to compensate for their farther reach and piercing range. For example, a high-ranged non-LD generalist unit might have around 5 to 6,000 DPS, maybe 7,000 for some of the stronger generalists. For an LD range generalist that maybe has a similar standing range, they tend to have maybe 3 to 5k DPS, with 5k being pretty high already. Meanwhile, Kasli's 9k, that is huge! But Kasli's high DPS calculation does kind of have a couple of caveats. One being that she's not exactly a high range unit. Her range is 375, which is just slightly above that of D'Artagnan. This is higher than Paris and lower than Dragon Cat. Lower range units tend to have higher damage output to compensate for their lack of survivability, so the common DPS comparison doesn't really apply to her. Giving her higher damage is actually just only fair. And number 2, this calculation is if and only if all of the attack hits, if the main attack hits and if the 2 of the surge hits. There are many reasons on why these attacks might not all land. For one, the surge could maybe miss the main target. It is randomly spawning after all. It's spawning in a somewhat predetermined area, but it's still somewhat random. So it could simply spawn on an undesirable position where it might not really hit the enemies that you want her to hit. In Kasli's case, her surge spawn location tends to be around farther than her main standing range. Her standing range is 375, but her surge generally spawns around 300 to 700. And so she actually somewhat struggles hitting enemies that are too close to her. She can hit enemies that are close to her, but it's really depending on where the surge spawns. And like I said, the surge generally favors spawning farther away from her. And 2, enemies could also reposition itself due to their knockback count, allowing them to escape the surge by repositioning backwards. And remember that she also has a 50% chance to knockback, so this knockback might not be induced by knockback count, it might just be induced by her ability. Plus, enemies that is able to tank her attacks without getting knocked back can also just walk past the surge. However, this knockback does synergize with the problem I mentioned earlier, being that her surge spawn location is farther than her target range, so she sometimes can push enemies near her into the surge. However, the knockback is still a random 50% chance and it's just not terribly reliable. Plus, there's also a lot of mid-range enemies that would simply escape the surge due to the knockback instead. So maybe the 9000 DPS calculation isn't super accurate, and due to her range, she can't quite be compared with other generic range LD attackers with higher standing range. Still, her surge spawn location is actually fairly accurate, often spawning in some sweet spot of enemies. Sometimes her attacks might land a little bit farther than what you want, but it's still pretty accurate. Plus, enemies that gets knocked back by her attack can still run back to the surge. Sometimes her knockback attack can even push enemies to the surge. And since the surge is a lingering thing, this also means that you create like this impassable wall where it would still hit other oncoming enemies. Even if the surge doesn't hit the same enemies multiple times, it can still hit different enemies, and it can basically still control crowds of peons very well. Even if you count just like 2 of her 3 hits consistently hitting enemies, that still would make her average DPS around 6000, which despite her range problem is still on the high end of LD units DPS. Plus, like I mentioned, the surge does kind of work as this like area of denial thing. This can really mess some enemies up and even kill some troublesome enemies before they can even reach the front lines. Some fast moving glass cannon enemies like Brawlos could easily just get walled off by her surge. This can be very helpful. Besides, she's not really the only unit in the game that has iffy DPS. Every units are prone to missing really, especially if you don't have a fast attack start off and no LD, as LD makes a lot of your attacks accurate. And having slow attack start off means that your enemy's target might actually just like be moving around or get knocked back when you're charging your attack. But Kasli actually has both LD and fast attack start off, so her attack is actually more on the accurate side of things. Still, it's hard to ignore the range problem that she has. 375 would still be classified as like maybe like a mid-ranger category, maybe a little bit of like the high end for a mid-ranger, but a lot of mid-range enemies, even if they don't outright outrange her, can still be quite a threat. Unlike Meowsketeer and D'Artagnan, she's not really built to be a rusher. Her survivability is kind of an actual issue, and her health isn't even really that high either. She has 49,000, which isn't necessarily low, but it's not quite high. She does have 5 knockback count, which helps her survivability, and her cooldowns is only 2 minutes, which is actually on the shorter ends of things to compensate, but certain high damaging enemies has the potential to maybe 2-shot her, or maybe even 1-shot if she's unlucky. Her range and health isn't necessarily low, but it's not that high either. Plus, her ability being knockback isn't usually something that people want. Knockback as an ability is really weird. It can sometimes be detrimental, as it can potentially push your own units into dangerous territory. Not to mention her knockback is a 50-50, meaning you don't really know what to expect. Sometimes she might knock back when you don't wish her to, and sometimes she might not trigger the knockback when you want her to. The way Surge works is that if the initial attack does knockback, then the Surge will always do knockback. If the initial attack doesn't do knockback, it will not do knockback at all. So if her main attack induces knockback, this Surge would also induce knockback. It's not like the Surge has like their own calculation, and this could mean she could really push your own units into danger. Though luckily, since she's LD, she is also able to push the backliner enemies back. Though this is still kind of, you know, not really something that not a lot of people like. But the good thing about Kasli is that even though she is an uberfest unit, despite everything, she's still really good against traitless enemies. Her damage output doesn't rely on any abilities whatsoever. Her only ability is knockback. Her main damage comes from her Surge, and her damage is still there even for traitless enemies. Hell, sometimes the lack of knockback to traitless could even be considered as a blessing. You don't need to worry about knowing what to expect from her 50-50, as you always know that she won't trigger a knockback. And maybe not triggering the knockback can help with consistency on her damage output. So she's still a pretty damn good unit, all things considered. And yeah, it's kind of ironic that she does more damage to the trait that she doesn't target. But, well, this isn't the only time that this happens. Actually, Street Fighter's Chun-Li and Thunderjack both have this issue too, where they're just better against enemies they don't knock back. It's pretty ironic. Anyways, even though Kasli still has her problem, which weighs her down, she still is considered to be a pretty strong Uber. Given that the Fest unit so far has been nothing but amazing, Kasli being also a high-ranking unit is not really a surprise to anyone. People expect that, and people also like welcome that. Now, even at this point in time, Mitama still is considered to be one of the best Ubers in the game. Despite new threats appearing, like the new relic typing, which has the ability to curse, which would disable Mitama's abilities, and even the surge attack that Mitama's not immune to, she's still an undeniably powerful unit. Not to mention the new relic and Aku typing both does not have treasures for their traits, meaning the problem that Dark Mitama has for having shorter slow duration for the traitless also applies to Mitama for relic and Aku. Aku's shield also makes Mitama harder to actually be effective, as they have a layer of defense that protects Aku enemies from debuffs. Her usages are definitely getting less relevant, and other Ubers are definitely stepping up their game in terms of the competition, but her strength is still just too good to pass up. Now, fast forward 3 months later, after the release of Kasli the Scourge. Update 9.5 dropped at the 15th of April, 2020. This is the beginning of the end times. Comes a unit that changes the meta of the game forever. The unit that has caused irreparable damage. No one could have suspected how bad it could have been. The unit that is shrouded in darkness, the one and only Miasma Cat. Okay, no, it's Kasli the Bane. From here on out, I'm going to refer Kasli the Bane as Dasli because it's just easier to say. And also that's probably what a lot of people are more familiar with. Following the pattern of the previous Epicfest, you can more or less, you know, kind of guess on how Dasli is gonna be like. You know, a slightly stronger version of Kasli the Scourge who focuses on traitless, isn't as good against traded enemies compared to Kasli, right? maybe that would be the case on an ideal world, but such this world is very much flawed. Dasli is the first Epicfest unit to actually break this tradition. Well, she is, you know, still like stronger in stats compared to Kasli, but that's not quite all. Original Kasli has the ability to have a 50-50% chance to knock back all traded enemies, right? Well, Kasli the Bane instead has guaranteed chance to curse all enemies, regardless of their trade. That's right. She does not only target traitless, she targets everything. I mentioned curse before. What exactly is curse? The short answer is basically curse disables enemies' debuffs. That's the gist of it. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it. Admittedly, cursing all enemies wasn't really considered to be a crazy thing at this point in time for several reasons. One being that there are only very few enemies that actually relies on debuffs to really be a threat. The other thing is that some of these enemies are already traitless, like Henry or Crockley, who does freeze and slow respectively. So whether she only curses traitless or cursing all enemies doesn't make too much difference at the time. Not to mention she was the very first unit to ever get the ability to curse, so frankly a lot of the people in the community weren't really experienced with using this ability. We're only ever experienced with this on the enemy side. So Kasli the Bane targeting everything with curse didn't actually felt like a huge deal at the time. Keyword at the time, because as time goes on, this ability certainly becomes more and more relevant with a lot more enemies with abilities starts to pop up. You can even disable enemies' curse with your own curse, and you're also able to disable toxic, which is huge on some enemies. But that's just the icing on the cake. This isn't exactly what makes her good. I mean, her curse is great, but it's far from what makes her solid. Remember how Kasli the Scourge has a level 2 surge that triples her damage? How about we make that quadruple? That's right. Where Kasli has level 2 surge with 9000 DPS, Dasli has level 3 surge with 12,000 DPS. 12,000 DPS for a level 30 LD unit is unheard of. It is insane. This is the kind of DPS some like specialist Ubers would have against one specific trade. What in the world you need this amount of damage for? You don't need all that. This is actually absurd. Oh, but the DPS isn't accurate. The surge has random spawn and can miss it. And yes, we've discussed this when we talked about Kasli the Scourge. Remember, she has LD, she has fast attack start off, the wall of surge, the precise spawn position. Dasli still retains all of these qualities. Okay, let's just say that out of the 3 surge that she has, only 2 will consistently hit. Oh look, it's still 9000 DPS. That is still massive. Okay, let's be really cruel and half the DPS. That's 6000 DPS, that still rivals some of the top tier LD Uber. And this is probably Dasli functioning at her worst day. She could miss half of her attacks and still be compared to the top tier LD Ubers. This is what makes Dasli absurdly good. She's an absolute powerhouse of a unit with absurd damage output. Seriously, no cat unit needs this amount of damage. This is stupid. But then you might say, wait, hold on, didn't you mention something about Kasli having range problem? About how her damage is kind of justified because of her 375 range. Well, Dasli's range is 400. That actually pulls her out of the more mid-range category and more to the low end of high ranger units. It's the same as Dragon Cat. It's pretty good still. Not only does she outrange a little bit more enemies, but also her survivability is much greater now. The range change actually also makes her surge spawn position to be more accurate than that of Kasli's. Remember, Kasli's surge spawn favors spawning a bit farther from her, right around 300 to 700. But since Dasli's surge spawn location is the same and her range is higher, then Dasli's surge spawn position actually aligns more accurately with her standing range. This range change actually makes her surge more consistent to what she's targeting. That's right, Dasli's 12,000 DPS calculation is more accurate than Kasli's 9,000. And then another thing is Dasli's health, being at 78,000 compared to Kasli's 49,000. This is a huge jump, not quite as big as D'Artagnan, but this is still really high. This is pretty much on the high end for range attackers, especially one with this damage output. Plus she retains her 5 knockback count, meaning that she's able to utilize her knockbacks better and survive for a great while. Like, okay, I did mention that Epicfest units generally have stronger stats compared to their uberfest counterpart, but this was reasonable only because Epicfest are only focused on traitless enemies, and so the uberfest counterpart has the better edge for the traded ones. Kasli, however, only has knockback as her ability, so she doesn't even have like a better effective stats against traded enemies, and yet Dasli still have all of these immense qualities and great stat boosts despite not being a traitless focused uber. What on earth was Pono's cooking? Where's the balance? By the way, we haven't even talked about one thing, the Epicfest bonus ability. Yeah, almost forget about that, haven't you? For Dasli, she has immunity to surge attacks, and once again, similar to her curse, this is the first time any unit has ever gotten this. At this point in time, there's only like 2 enemies with surge, Saint Dober and Cappy Jr. That's not much, of course, but the amount of surge enemies increases as time goes by as more updates rolls out, especially with the introduction of the Aku enemies and their trademark Death Surge, and a lot of other enemies that just does normal surge. Slowly but surely, her surge immunity becomes even more relevant as time goes on. Remember, Kasli the Scourge's weaknesses are her relatively low range, her random inconsistent knockback, her somewhat mediocre health, especially for someone with her range, and her inconsistent damage output. But all of this disappears on Dasli. She doesn't really have any of these weaknesses. She actually has pretty respectable range, she has incredibly high health, she doesn't have random knockback ability that might screw her over, her surge spawn position is more aligned with her attacks, she was given a new curse ability that can shut down gimmicks, she still retains Kasli's 2-minute cooldown, which remember is on the shorter end of things, and she was now given the immunity from enemy surge attacks. And this is even more relevant because recently there has been a new ability called Surge Counter, where if an enemy gets hit by a surge, they will return with their own surge. This is a problem for Kasli the Scourge because even though she does surge, she is not immune to one, but Dasli does not care about this because even though she does surge, she still is surge immune anyway, so she's not affected by this. Like, what more do you even want? You just want her to have an ability that just wins the stage if you spawn her? I mean, she already does that to a lot of stage. The combination of her unfair damage output, long distance ability, piercing, area denial surge, that not only allows for huge brute force but also means that she cares very little about enemy standing range, and the ability to curse to even shut down gimmicks. Hell, even if you argue that she has the weakness of her standing range being 400 could be higher, this 400 range actually still has an advantage which allows her to be able to not get hit by certain LD enemies attack. There are a couple of LD enemies that tries to snipe down high range cat units, enemies like Taki or Loris or Henry. Her range being at 400 is actually a sweet enough spot to be able to both safely outrange a lot of enemies as well as being able to not get targeted by some of these LD snipers as she can just walk into the blind spot. If your cat's range is too high, you might get juggled by these enemies. But since her range is short enough, she can actually enter a lot of these blind spots. Call this unit sheer heart attack, as Kasli the Bane has no weaknesses. Okay, she does have a problem entering LD enemies blind spot because of her long backswing, which I guess is a weakness. Which even then, long backswing is usually a good thing for your survivability, but the other problem that she also has is that she can't really hit enemies that are too close to her. But honestly, this is barely a problem, as one, this is the case for literally every LD unit, including both Mitamas and both Meowsketeer and D'Artagnans. And two, there's lots of ways to circumvent this. There's lots of like common rares and super rares mid-rangers. These guys can easily deal with close range combat. Things like Pizza, Mushroom Castaway, Courier, and so much more that are just really good units. Boulder Cat can also stall incredibly well, especially paired with the Research combo, forcing your enemies to get stuck for a whole second while Dasli rains hell on them. Or you can even bring units that can knock your enemies back to synergize with her, or pushing them with your Breaker Blast cannon, or freezing them or slowing them with your cannon. And 3 is that her surge is a literal wall that a lot of peons can't even pass through, so unless you're a fast moving tanky enemies like Angelic Gory or Boar enemies, chances are you can't even pass through the surge at the first place. I mean, I'll admit, this is a fairly legit weakness, it's just not one that's gonna be like commonly that problematic for her. Also, you can literally boost her to like level 50 or 60 once you reach UL using Dark Cat size. These footages that you're seeing right now, all of these are level 40. All of the Ubers featured here are level 40. She's not level 50 here. She's not even in her top form. If a level 40 unit can already brute force most of the stages shown here, what about 50 or 55 or 60? This quote-unquote weakness of her is a legitimate problem, sure, but it's almost like a default setting rather than an actual weakness. By the way, you can actually use this quote-unquote weakness to your advantage too. You could potentially stack her up by allowing weak enemies into her blind spot and stall for another Dasli's cooldown to go off. If you thought 12k DPS wasn't bad enough, you can make that 24k if you have 2 of her in the field. Nothing's gonna survive that. Hell, due to her short cooldown, great health and knockback count, and great survivability in general, you don't even need a setup to stack her sometimes. Sometimes the previous Dasli would just live long enough naturally for you to spawn a second Dasli. And once you have 2 Daslis on the field, it's just game over for the enemies. It's just a wall of death. Why does this unit have everything, hello? Even any supposed weakness of her becomes a strength sometimes.
Actually, Lucas, you also said that D'Artagnan too has this like no weakness thing going on, so...
Okay, D'Artagnan is different. Even though D'Artagnan covered up Meowsketeer's weakness, his stats doesn't really outshine that of Meowsketeer's. His damage output is still lower, and his damage only rivals Meowsketeer when D'Artagnan is at half health. And you know what's worse? If you compare D'Artagnan and Dasli, D'Artagnan strengthens damage is worse than Dasli. In fact, his general stats is worse than Dasli. D'Artagnan has standing range at 340 with LD hitting to 550 and base 10,000 DPS when strengthened, which is when he's at half health. While Dasli stands at 400 range with LD hitting to 675 and 12,000 DPS without needing any setups at full HP. This damage output even is almost as good as Meowsketeer's, and Meowsketeer has significantly lower range, half the health, no immunity to surge, no damage to traitless enemies. And remember that both D'Artagnan and Meowsketeer are considered pretty top tier Uber already. It's not just that Dasli lacks weakness, it's that she also has insane stats on top of that. The Musketeer duo are supposed to be like suicidal rusher units, which justifies their high damage output because they're supposed to die quick, and yet Dasli, who's a safe range unit, has similar damage output without being suicidal. What in the world is this unit?
Actually, Lucas, Kasli the Scourge's knockback is actually more relevant as it affects more enemies compared to Curse, which only shuts down enemies with gimmicks.
Frankly, that really doesn't matter. Remember the G.Mitama and Mitama comparison? Who needs the knockback ability when you can just kill the enemies? Enemies can't hurt you if they're dead, and through pure brute force you can just knock them back using damage.
Actually, Lucas, you can't brute force literally everything. Mitama is still more broken because she can perma-slow enemies regardless of their stats.
Okay, let's be real here. Outside of maybe 3-star UL and like gauntlet stages, most enemies are weak enough to be brute forced, even in ZL, which is like the current endgame. Like, they put 100% Borofim in ZL. Polos don't know what they're doing, man. There's a handful of exceptions, sure, but this is true to essentially most enemies. If you have half of a functioning frontal lobe, meat shielding and Dasli can and will murder majority of stages.
But Lucas, there's stages that doesn't favor units with long cooldown. But Lucas, these stages favors like melee units, actually. These enemies have like surge immunity. But Lucas, actually, she can't solo Korea. Wow, what a good joke, never heard that one before. Let's be real, all of these are just like, oh, she could have been more broken. Oh, she could have made me insta-win stages if I spawn her. Oh, she could have been buffed to literally just hack the game and allow me to win 50 billion cat food every time I spawn her. None of these are real weaknesses. Even the surge immunity enemies, like, okay, most of these enemies are behemoths, they're courier fodders. There are not that much relevant stages where enemies having surge immunity matters. I would argue that this maybe matters to like Zappy. That one's somewhat valid, but this is one enemy out of like the god knows like almost like hundreds, thousands of enemies there are. It's far from being a true weakness. In terms of real weaknesses, she basically have none, and she still has extreme strength on top of that. Remember that before this, Mitama was the one considered to be amongst the best of the best. She has some competitors at this point, but she's still up there, and yet she has myriads of issues. Low standing range, low base HP, potentially gets juggled by LD enemies, not immune to surge, not immune to curse, and essentially useless against
traitless enemies, and she's still top tier, and she's beloved one at that. Meanwhile, I look at Kasli the Bane and I think to myself, did Ponos even playtest her at all? I don't think this unit's supposed to exist. I don't think this unit should exist. I think this unit's a mistake. This might be pretentious for me to say, but I feel like the game has actually gone downhill since now. Well, okay, Aku Realms is the exception. Aku Realms is peak. But after Aku Realms, they released Behemoths, which is like, you know, the game goes downhill again. From here on out, it's not quite a surprise that a lot of players end up trying their hardest to get Kasli the Bane through any means necessary. Whether it be saving up all your tickets and cat food for Epicfest, using, you know, like real life money, using your mom's credit card by acquiring their inheritance through unnatural means, or even just straight up cheating to get Dasli. And boy, I know lots of you cheats to get Dasli. You know who you are. After all, it almost feels like you don't even need any other Ubers once you have Kasli the Bane. This unit is just that stupidly powerful, to a point where this strategy game no longer requires strategy for half of the stages. Yeah, sure, you can argue, you know, like there's the Ubers like Yukimura or Balrog, which are like the melee units. But when it comes to range attacker, Kasli the Bane covers literally everything. And range attack is pretty much relevant for like majority of the game. People who utilize Dasli often would have an absurdly different experience than that of players who don't have her. She destroys stages so badly that most stages felt the same, and even come to a point where people wouldn't require any strategy to beat most stages except for just spawning Dasli and meat shielding. Like damn, I could tell a caveman to do that right before the caveman smashes my head with a club, but the caveman can do that. In fact, it has been so bad that it's not even uncommon for me to see someone in the community asking for help in stages that a lot of other people consider pretty easy, but they couldn't do it because the stage isn't compatible with Dasli or doesn't allow usage of Dasli. Don't get me wrong, you can't quite literally beat the entire game with Dasli, and well, okay, you sorta can. You might already know a Japanese YouTuber by the name 7 or Shishi has been able to beat quite literally every stages in the game with like 7 units, and his only main range attacker is Dasli. But well, to a common player, maybe you can't quite literally beat the entire game with just Dasli. Dasli users sometimes will still have to put some actual effort on certain stages and maybe experience similar things with others. But for the most part, yeah, Dasli does actually trivialize basically like majority of stages. So now I guess you understand the real absurdity of the existence of Dasli, but you might still ask like, what exactly is the problem though? Like, yeah, she's broken, but like, come on, this is a single player game. A broken unit in multiplayer would be understandably hated, but why would you hate this unit in a single player game? If you don't like the unit, just don't use him. I don't see where the problem is.
Why do you hate Dasli so much?
Cause Dasli killed my grandma, okay? But no, I get it, that's kind of a fair point. Sure, I can't speak for everyone on this matter, but the way I see it, the problem does appear on some different angles. There are several ways to look at this problem. The most obvious one is that if someone's passionate about game design and balancing in any games in general, then I don't really need to explain why this would piss someone off. The other angle you could view is that this is a way for Ponos to easily cash grab without much thought. Dasli being this hard to get unit would be bound to bring in some cash for people who really want her. Honest player would have to actually pay a good amount of money to have a good chance of getting her. And of course people want her, everyone is using her, and the other players are bound to be FOMO'd. You could argue the same to maybe Mitama and the other fest, but Dasli is very clearly on a much different level of insanity and is on everyone's must-have list. As for me personally, maybe I lean more to the first point. I don't like how unbalanced she is in a game that is honestly used to be pretty balanced. I know it's such a boomer mentality to go like, damn it, I miss the good old days, but it's kinda true. I mean, maybe this isn't specifically a Dasli thing, but there's so many Ubers that are kinda invalidated now due to crazy broken top tiers that does everything. If you're a Dasli user, let me ask you, out of all the Ubers that you have, how much of them do you ever use for more than like 2 stages? I'd imagine the only other Ubers that you use are like melee units like Balrog or Yukimura, or extreme specialists like Clay or Saki, or combo Ubers like Vigler and Kunio. Am I correct? Like with how broken Dasli is, you need to be an actual god of a specialist to outclass a freaking generalist. Like, is that just not so absurd? Even Gao and Mitama has loads of competitors for specialist units. You got Ubers who has guaranteed freeze like Nobunaga, Ice Cat, Poseidon, Volta, who can outclass Mitama G.Mitama for their specific targets that they counter. Or even specialist damagers like Buzzybastra, Jizzo, Reikai, Pai Pai, who can far outclass S.Gao if the stage focuses on the trait that they target. And yeah, sure, some of these units can outclass Dasli too in their own niche, but it's gonna be a far tougher competition when Dasli also has immunities, curse, LD, and all those crazy stuff. All that over a generalist, by the way, who performs much better in a mixed trait stages, which is like basically almost every stage. Even if your specialist is good against one of the trait in the stage, what about the other threats? Sure, your Tundia, who deals massive damage against red, could deal with the Berserkori in Ogre Island. But why settle for Tundia when you can just use Dasli, who can deal with both the Berserkori and the Manic Islands? Why stop at countering one when you can counter all? Not to mention Dasli has wave immunity, surge immunity, and ability to disable gimmicks. And Berserkori has waves. So not only she thrives against stages with multiple traits, she also thrives against mixed traits and mixed gimmicks. Plus, most players simply wouldn't really want to grind for resources on Ubers that they know will only outclass Dasli for like a handful of stages. So chances are these Ubers are probably left with no investment on them in favor of Dasli. Literal hundreds of Ubers are invalidated by owning this one unit. There's so much cool and interesting Ubers that just never get to see the light of day and rarely ever put in a spotlight, and maybe they'll have like 2 or 3 people vouching for them, while others most likely probably never remember their existence in the first place. And frankly, as a member of the Battlecats community for like nearly a decade, I know that's crazy, this sucks. Like, discussions about Ubers become so much monotonous, as if you're discussing an Uber who cannot beat Dasli, you're just instantly irrelevant. Nobody's gonna ever talk about you or discuss you. The game becomes a game of just getting Dasli instead of trying out every new unit that you got or trying up to come up with new strategies, being a little bit more creative, you know? But no, the game is just farm until you get Dasli. It sucks, man. This isn't the game that I like. I don't think this is a specifically Dasli only thing though. I think Ponos has been shifting into this weird, insane generalist meta slowly over the past years, as well as the design philosophy of how getting specific units to counter niche are now more important than strategizing with what you have. But I do think that Dasli is probably one of the biggest turning point that Ponos had, and probably the biggest middle finger to any semblance of Uber balancing. I hate this unit so much. And sure, you might say, okay Lucas, what about other broken units like Yuki Balrog, or newer Fest units like Fanoa or Dark Fanoa? I think Yuki and Balrog is a little bit different. It's hard to talk about it, but it'll be a whole different discussion. I also don't really care too much about the Fanoas. It's an entirely different discussion, but like, I don't really care about that right now. Dasli was enough to make me lose hope. Also, this video is like almost an hour long, okay? If I talk about like every broken unit, this video will come out in 2026. Please give me a break. Look, I don't want to say like, oh, the player should stop using her or something along those lines. Like, it's not really wrong to use her. Unless you cheat to get her, then I would say you're actually wrong for that. But if a player was given like a legendary rare tool that helps them beat the game, they would want to use the legendary rare tool to play the game. And that is fine. That is up to the player to choose whether they want to use it or not. I think ultimately the most important thing is for the player to have fun. I think it is fine to use the most broken Ubers. I think it is fine to make like suboptimal plays. I think it is fine to spend your cat food on questionable purchases. As long as you have fun, that's great. But damn, this is not the game I'm familiar with. Okay, this may have turned from an analysis into like a personal rant. And I'm sorry about that, but this still is, I think, why people hate this special great curse unit.
Anyways, what do you think of her? Do you like her? Do you hate her? Tell them what you think in the comments. Were you surprised with the absurdity of her at all? Have you relented and sold your soul for her? Or would you go back in time to delete her from existence and instead transfer her strength to Papaluga? I'd like to hear your opinion regarding this matter. I think this unit's just stupid. Like, the more and more I get footages for this video for Dasli, the more and more I just hate her. Like, damn, this unit really is stupid. Also, sorry that this video took so long to make for such a stupid topic. It was kind of hard to find motivation to start making this video. It's been a while since I do like a talk video like this, and I instantly came back with like an hour of me rambling about Dasli again. President of Dasli Hater Club right here. Anyways, that is Kasli, the bane of my temper. Thanks for watching. I really do hope you enjoyed. Catch you another time. See ya.